ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
We all know that scene in the movies where someone's lost a child and they're overwhelmed with horror and shock, and someone comes to console them, and the grief-stricken parent turns around on them in a fury and says, "You can't possibly know what this is like." Well, Martha Jabour knows what it's like. Martha was named the 2025 New South Wales Local Hero in the Australia Day Awards for helping people in their blackest hour of need. Martha helped establish a homicide victims support group to rally around those people who've lost someone they dearly loved, particularly the children left behind when a parent is killed. Martha was asked to do this after her extraordinary success working with a support group for parents who'd lost a child to sudden infant death syndrome. And this is something that had happened to Martha in the 1980s when so little was known about this, and it pulled her whole life inside out. Martha lent her energy to fundraising and was able to unleash a tsunami of donations to fund research and public education. And with that, the incidence of SIDS, this awful catastrophic thing, has dropped dramatically in this country. Martha Jabour is a great mender of broken things, and it's really lovely to have her here. Hi, Martha.
Hi, Richard.
You're the daughter of Lebanese migrants who came to Australia. You settled in Campsie in Sydney's western suburbs. What are your memories of growing up in that suburb as a girl?
Well, my parents came out to Australia when I was a year and a half. They were sponsored by my mum's brother and my dad's aunt, who lived in Campsie. So already they were embraced with love and support before they even got here. And growing up in Campsie was just so fantastic.
Why was that?
Because there was community. It was a community that was, one, a little bit known to my parents with the relatives, but we had the most beautiful neighbours. They couldn't speak Arabic. My mum and dad couldn't speak English. They didn't need words to communicate. And so there was always someone looking over to support my mum and dad and to look after them. And I remember, we'd get Christmas cakes from the neighbours, homemade Christmas cakes. Now, that's community. Someone would always put something over the fence or put something on the front door because they knew my mum and dad were a young family, and it was because of that that my parents assimilated so well in the community that they got involved in the community.
So there was a whole culture of showing up when someone needs help then?
Well, it became quite natural that when someone helped my mum and dad would do the same. And I guess for me, I was the eldest of 7 children. And so we had beautiful
That means lots of responsibility for you then?
It was a lot of responsibility. My dad worked very, very hard. Growing up, I guess until I was probably in my late teens, we hardly saw my dad. He worked overnight time. And my mum was the homemaker and my mum was the rock of our family because Dad would be away working nights, daytime, we'd be at school, Dad would be asleep. So come the weekend, it was everything to our family. That's when we all regrouped and, Sunday lunch was mandatory, that we're all there. And to a degree, it's still there that we try and catch up on Sundays as a family.
How big were your parents on things like civility and good manners?
Huge. I very often relay this story that whenever we visited relatives, my dad always said to us, when you go and they offer you something to drink, of course you say thank you, but you never drink everything in your glass. You always leave a little bit in the bottom. And I always remember that, and I do it even to this day.
Oh, that's hard for kids. That's really hard for kids.
It is. But it was showing gratitude, but also that you're not that greedy either, that you had to drink it all. So manners was a big thing for my dad.
Right, so no eating with your hands in front of the TV, in other words.
No. It was always at the table with the family. So I'm very lucky that my mum's still with us. She's 81. Her and my dad were married for over 60 years. And when they'd fight, it was a big fight. And I'd always say to my siblings, don't take sides. and don't make a comment, because when they make up, you're going to be on the outer. And that's what it was. So right until the end, my mum and dad just had the most beautiful love. And my dad, the regret that I have with my dad's death is I didn't get somebody to take a photo. My dad was surrounded by all of us, my 6 siblings and myself, our children, my mum, relations. We said prayers. And he died so peacefully. And I think it was a bit of a godsend from many angels up there that my dad didn't suffer, and he just died so peacefully, and it was beautiful. That's helped me cope.
You say you don't have a photo, but you just painted the most beautiful picture. You've got the picture in your head.
Oh, it'll never leave me. It'll never leave me.
So what did you do when you left high school, Martha? What was your plan?
Growing up, people would say, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I'd say, I want to be a nurse. But my dad said no.
Why?
Because nurses back then had to live away from home, and I was the eldest of 7, and girls don't move out of home back then. It's like you got to, live in nurses' quarters, and who knows what might happen out there. So my dad said no. And I went, and me being the daughter that I am, I went, okay. And then I thought, well, my mother said, good girls, they do secretarial work. So off I went to St. Joseph's Business College at Leichhardt. And the thing with St. Joseph's, it was a great business college because at the end of the day, when your parents paid so much money for you to go there, they found you a job. And so I did bookkeeping typist. I was bookkeeper typist, and I loved doing all of that work. I got my first job, and it's this accounting firm in Campsie. My mother and father were elated. I didn't have to get on a bus or a train. I would just walk to work and walk back home, and it was safe. But I didn't stay there for too long for a whole range of reasons. And I rang Sister Eileen, who was the principal at St. Joe's, and I said, it's not really working out here with this job. I'm really not enjoying it. So she found me another job. It was with this jewellery store, Gemcraft International, in Favaux Street, Surrey Hills. And I got my independence then because I got on a train, I walked up to my work. I spent so much money buying the jewellery that was in this store. It was a lot of fun.
So quite quickly you fell in love and you got married.
I did.
Did you want to have kids straight away?
I wanted to have a family straight away, which is what I did. And then Angus, my eldest son, he's 40 now. He was born in 1984. And then in 1986, I had Michael. So he was born on the 26th of March, and my beautiful boy died on the 21st of May.
What can you tell me about the circumstances of that?
Angus was 19 months old, roughly, and Michael was a very healthy baby. Both my children were born very healthy. With Michael, I'd been to the baby health clinic on the Friday, and they said he's above average with his weight, with his height, he's doing really well. As a parent, that's all you want to hear, that your baby's healthy and you're quite content. And then some days after, I'd fed Michael at about 2 o'clock in the morning of the 21st of May, and then at about 7 o'clock, he should have been up by then. And I just reached over and my baby had died throughout the night.
Was he in the room with you?
Yeah, right beside me. So I got up and I picked him up and the nightmare started.
If I'm looking back at that time, if I try to even remember what was known about that phenomenon, we called it cot death back then, didn't we?
Yeah, that was the common
name.
Yeah.
We now call it sudden infant death syndrome.
Yeah.
How little was known back then?
Very little. There was research being done into why a seemingly healthy baby would be put down to sleep and then some hours would be found dead. But there was very little known about it. All I wanted to know was, why did my baby die? What did I do wrong? What went wrong? It's like you lose all faith in yourself and all confidence, and the more you ask, the more the answer is, we don't know. We don't know why babies like this, who are healthy, are put down and then die.
Because he died so suddenly, the police had to attend the scene. What happened when the police arrived?
That was traumatic in the sense that 2 police officers turned up. One was an older police officer. I can just remember their faces as I sit here today. And the older of the police officers asked my husband all the questions. I could hear the questions and thinking, why isn't he asking me? Like, was he healthy? When did he last get his last feed? Was he sick at all? Tell me when he was put down to sleep. They're questions my husband couldn't answer. But nobody asked me. And I can't say that I was hysterical. I wasn't. I was just numb. But there was a young police officer, and I could see that he was visibly upset. So he was sitting on the front doorstep of our home, and I just went and sat near him. And this policeman was just so distressed. It was the first dead human being he'd seen, and it had to be my 7-week-old son. And he was mumbling some words, and I agreed with him that, life was not a very nice life. And the ambulance turned up, and I said goodbye to my baby. That was the last time I ever saw him. They took him away. So for weeks after his funeral, I very often wondered about that poor policeman. And I thought, I wonder what he's doing. I hope he's coping okay. So even, I guess, in my time of grief, I was still thinking about another person that had been affected by my son's death.
After he died, you approached the Sudden Infant Death Association. What was it like to make contact with them at that time?
They were my lifeline. They actually approached me, and that came through from New South Wales Ambulance, who said to me, do you want us to put you in contact with a group called the Sudden Infant Death Association? I said yes, like straight away. I was looking for answers. I was looking for support. And 2 days after Michael's death, these 2 amazing women who were mums whose babies had died of cot death came into my home and changed my life.
How did they do that?
They told me there's nothing that I could have done to have prevented Michael's death.
What was it like to hear that?
Oh, it was a relief, because I thought, look at them, like their babies had died, and if they've survived, well, I'm going to be able to survive. They reassured me that they would be there to support me and that there are other parents like myself. So all of a sudden, I'm part of a group of people that were feeling exactly like me. And they said they would be there for as long as I needed them to be there for me. And I think I needed to hear that it wasn't going to be like someone that came in and said, hi, how you going? Here's some booklets, read them, and off they go. They were there for me. And so a month after Michael died, they invited me to a support group meeting, like it was a morning tea. And I wasn't really up to it. And I went, no, I don't want to go. And then they offered the next time to come and pick me up. And that made all the difference. It was a lot of grief to take on, but at the end of the day, we're all going through the same thing regardless of where the child was that had died. It was tiring, it was exhausting to hear other people's stories and pain, but I knew for me, unless I heard their stories, I was not going to survive, because I needed to know that I was not the only one, and the things that I was going through were fairly normal the emotions were normal. Because when you're a parent, your mind goes into overdrive. You're thinking about all sorts of things that, what if I'd done that? What if I could have done that? Maybe I shouldn't have fed him at that hour or whatever. Your mind goes a bit crazy. And mine was until I'd met these mums and dads.
You had your older, beautiful boy.
Yeah.
Did this make you a bit hypervigilant around him?
Oh, totally. Totally. I hardly slept. It was like babies normally died within 2 weeks or 2 years of their life. Sometimes it was a little bit older than 2 years. There were a couple that their babies had died after the age of 2. And so when Angus got to 2 years and 2 weeks, I relaxed.
You mentioned there you wanted to track down that young constable, Michael, who had gotten so distressed to the extent where you had to comfort him after the death of your baby.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Well, it was hard. I'd call at the police station where Michael had come from and the other police officer at all hours of day or night just to check in, see how he was. And I didn't really get an answer. It was basically, he's this grieving mother, just say a few things that'll make her feel okay. Off we go.
There's a crazy lady on the phone.
Yeah,
was that it?
I think it was about 2:00 in the morning one morning where I rang. I couldn't sleep. And I thought, well, if I can't sleep, I'm going to ring and see whether, because he's not on shift, he's on holidays, he's on days off. So I thought, 2:00 in the morning, I'll have someone to chat to. And this police officer on the other end said, he's not on shift. But, lady, we can't really give you a lot of information, because of privacy. And I said, all I want to know is he okay? And he said, look, at the end of the day, what is it that you want to do? And I said, and out of nowhere, I'm a bookkeeper typist, a mum now, and all I wanted to do, I said to him, was to talk to police about how not to treat family members like me.
And what did this officer say when you said
And he said, look, I know what I can do. How about tomorrow you ring up the Goulburn Police Academy and you speak to this woman called Jane Moses. She looks after education down there, and have a talk to her and maybe she can help you. The next day, I just got a little bit determined and I rang and I just told her my spiel. And I said, this is what happened. My baby died. I had these 2 police officers come. One was big, burly, and he asked my husband all the questions. But the young one I worry about because he was so upset, and I just wanted to see how he was doing, and no one will tell me. And she said, well, you know what? In a couple of weeks, we've got a probationary constable's training day coming up. How about you come down and tell your story? And I went, oh, okay. And I hung up and I called my parent contact, Jackie Barrett, who was the founding member of the Sudden Infant Death Association in New South Wales. And I said, Jackie, you're not going to believe what I've just done. She said, what? And I said, I've spoken to Jane Moses down at the academy and they want me to go down and to present, but I can't go down without you. And she said, oh my God, I've been trying for 10 years to get a gig down there. So on this really cold, windy night, Jackie had one of those little mini minor cars. She was driving down the academy and I'm thinking, are we ever going to get there? Because the wind was taking the car from one side of the road to the other.
You're going to be blown like a leaf off the Hume Highway, are you?
And oh my God, are we ever going to get there? And we got there, we stayed the night, the howling winds through the towers down in Goulburn. Anyway, the next morning we get up and we walk into this auditorium and it was just filled with young faces. And every face I looked at looked like the police officer that had come to my home. So Jackie talked about the Sudden Infant Death Association, about her daughter Rebecca, what the challenges were. I talked about Michael and what had happened to my life, his life, our life. And then some weeks later, Jane contacted me and said, Martha, we've got the feedback sheets and your session with Jackie rated the highest that we've ever seen. And will you continue to come down to talk at these presentations, these lectures. So from that, the police invited me to write Police Lecture 90 on sudden infant death syndrome, to rewrite it. And then we put a panel together of experts that travelled around the state to teach police, especially rural, remote New South Wales, you know, how to deal with family members whose babies have died of sudden infant death syndrome.
What was your advice to them on how to handle these situations better rather than going in and being bluff or, on the other hand, breaking down completely?
So we had this panel of experts in our fields, and so telling Michael's story and what happened to me was all they needed to hear. And then it was a case of them asking me questions. Well, would you have liked the police officer asking all the questions to ask you? And my answer was yes, because I had all the answers. And I guess for the young police officer, what I would say is just making sure that there was support for them when they did go back to work.
You were working more and more with the Sudden Infant Death Syndrome Association, doing counselling, and then you got into fundraising. My God.
Yeah.
The fundraising, it was insanely successful.
It was phenomenal, that whole thing. In the early days, when the concept of Red Nose Day came about, there were some members of the Sudden Infant Death Association, I guess the hierarchy, and some parents who said, we can't sell red noses, like you can't make fun of something so serious. But Bob Geldorf had done the Red Nose Day appeal for people who were hungry around the world, and it was hugely successful. So the first thing was being able to get over that barrier, that we're not making fun of the deaths of our children, but it was a case of bringing people together. And so a small group of us from the New South Wales team, we decided that we're going to go ahead and we're going to sell these red noses and just see what happens. And if we raised $10,000 or $20,000, that would be great. So with my sisters and their friends and Yvonne and her family, we saturated the city railway stations. The first day we ran it, we thought, maybe 100,000 red noses. They were like $2 each. Maybe that would be enough. And so by 10 o'clock, we had sold every red nose. So we had to call in more.
$200,000 within a couple of hours.
Yeah. Yvonne's two sons were in the fireys, and they were stationed at the City Central Fire Brigade. We had to call them to come and take the money to the bank in the fire truck.
They were your armoured car, were they?
Oh, my God. Well, we had money that had to be picked up from every railway station in the city circle. There was too much cash. There were too many. And people, oh, my God, the generosity of people. It was not just buying a red nose, it was also making donations. We made so much money. And so then that continued. Every year that's what we would do. So I can confidently say that with my friends, my family, Yvonne, her family, and then the other parents and their friends that came along, we raised over $1 million in the first couple of years of Red Nose Day running. So then it was a case of there was some research being done, and it was very promising research about reducing the risks.
Okay, so you're tipping all that money towards research into the causes of SIDS to find out what the science of it actually is.
Yeah.
What was the research starting to find out?
Well, the research was starting to find out that if you didn't smoke near your child, you laid your child on their back and not on their stomach, you didn't overheat at all, like not put on lots of blankets and not to put those coverings that we put in cribs and cradles. So letting the airflow go through and breastfeeding your child.
It's an easy temptation to succumb to over-swaddle your child, isn't it?
Totally.
Because you think you're acting to protect them because they're all beautifully bundled up and they can't pull themselves out of the cot or anything
That's
like
right.
that.
Yep, and for me it was May, it was cold. So I was breastfeeding Michael. I didn't smoke. No one in our family smoked. It was winter. Maybe the overheating was a big thing. And he was on his stomach.
Finding this stuff out, Does it help to know the science of this for you?
It did help me a lot. It did help a lot of families, a lot, to be able to cope with, well, it's not our fault, but this could possibly be one of the causes.
Martha, I've got 2 kids, and by the time they arrived, we were well aware of what the risk factors were for SIDS and were able to act preemptively on it. How dramatically has the incidence of sudden infant death syndrome declined since you've all been on the case of this?
It has declined dramatically. So the year that Michael died, there was over 550 babies who had died in Australia, and babies still die of SIDS today, even with the Reduce the Risk campaign that we ran. There's roughly about 50, way too many families that go through what I went through.
You mean it's like less than a tenth of what it once was?
Yeah.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Feidler. You can find more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app, or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
After the death of your child, you subsequently had another child, a beautiful baby daughter. Tell me about her.
Jamelia, light of my life. So after Michael's death, of course, marriages suffer, terribly. My husband and I, we grieved in very different ways. He went back to work pretty much straight after Michael's funeral, and we rarely talked about Michael. I wanted help, I needed support, got involved, as I've said, with the Sudden Infant Death Association. He'd come along to a few things, but it was not his thing, and our lives just drifted. But we worked hard at staying together for Angus's sake. I didn't want my child to grow up without 2 parents, especially in view of the fact that Michael had died. So in 1990, our beautiful daughter Jamelia was born, and I thought that was going to put our marriage back on track, but it didn't, sadly. And so Jamelia became my lifeline. So talking about sleeping, that didn't happen for me. Once again, new baby. I was not going to let her out of my sight. And Jamelia had a monitor. So the monitor was a pretty fancy one. We embarked on a research project, and Jamelia had a corometrics monitor, not the flatbed mattress monitors, but this one was actually hooked up to Jamelia.
Like a Holter monitor, that kind of thing?
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
In other words, your baby was rigged up so a siren would go ooga in the middle of the night if something went wrong?
Absolutely. I was not taking any risk with this one.
Could you sleep with that on her then, or were you still half awake?
I was still half awake. And there were other parents that were in the same research project, and when we'd have a subsequent baby to the baby that had died, they were our subby bubbies. So there were lots of subby bubbies who were a part of this research project and who were hooked up like little aliens, and it did give us a little bit of peace of mind.
And they're too young to be bothered by it, aren't they?
So for 2 years, 4 months, Jamelia and I very rarely spent any time apart, and wherever I went, Jamelia went, even to conferences. I took her along with me, and it was a wonderful thing to see my child survive.
So you have this lovely little girl in your life. You're doing all this great work in the SIDS support group, and you're also helping parents who are at the Glebe mortuary. What was the nature of your work there?
So as I'm talking to parents, because in between that I trained with Mal and Di McKissick at the Bereavement Care Centre to be a grief and trauma counsellor. I wanted to do trauma work, I wanted to do counselling work, and I did lots of training with Mal McKissick, who taught me everything I know and I just absolutely loved the man. And then I went on and did other training. And so for me, working at the mortuary, I got this little area in the social work team, and I left my kit there, and when a baby would die, I'd be called either to Glebe or Westmead, and I'd do that for the babies and for the parents more than anything.
That's when you met the parents of a little girl called Ebony Simpson who'd been horribly, callously murdered. What did those parents need at that stage that they weren't getting?
So when Ebony was murdered, her body was brought to Glebe for a post-mortem. Some months later, her parents asked, what is there for parents like us, of the head of the social work team at Glebe? And the answer was nothing. There was no support group. There was no structured counselling for families like them. And the thought was that if we introduced Ebony's parents, Peter and Christine and her two brothers, to the parents of Anita Cobby, who had been killed in 1986, Gary and Grace Lynch, who went through the most public murder of their beautiful daughter Anita and survived, maybe they could help get Peter and Christine and their boys. And when the two family members met, that was the birth of the Homicide Victims Support Group. And at first I said, no, I'm not going to do it. Like, God, homicide. And it was a case of, I love doing what I'm doing. I want to just stick with the SIDS work. And after a little while, it was like, how about you help us for a year, help us set it up? Martha, no one ever says no to you, was the words that I got. So we got a whole group of family members together and they told us what they needed. They told us that if there was a support group, what it would look like. We put an advisory council together, and that was like the state coroner, police officers, healthcare workers, and they gave us the other side of what they could do. And then we had our first meeting on the 7th of September, 1993, and Gary Lynch, Anita Cobby's dad, who I'd never met before, came up and put his arms around my shoulders and he, said hello to me, and he said, so you're the young woman that's going to help us mend our broken hearts. And I looked up at him and I thought to myself, what in the frig is this man talking about? Like, how can anybody help him mend his broken heart? Like, how can that be? So the support group went on. For me, my 1 year has turned into 31 and a half years. I never went back to doing my work with SIDS, and I've been running the Homicide Victims Support Group ever since. So then we go back to Gary's words, and it wasn't until 3 or 4 years later that I realised the wisdom of his words, and it was about we'd set up this support network where family members of homicide victims, like sudden infant death victims, could walk into a room and they knew that everybody in that room knew what they were going through. And Gary Lynch would be the one to greet the other fathers, to give them a hug, to shake their hands, to say, I'm going to be in court with you, I'm going to support you, here's my number, ring me any time of day or night. And that was the beauty of the group being set up.
Starting the work meant you had to reach out to families who have lost someone to murder, homicide in the family. And you've got to pick up the phone and make the phone call, much the same way someone all those years ago picked up the phone and rang you after you lost your baby.
Yeah.
How hard is it to do that? And how do you find the courage to do that, to step into that world, to make that decision, not just to be nearby, but to actually to step right into that black world that person's found themselves in?
I was so naive at that initial time. I was shown a table, and on that table were all these buff folders, and they were about 10 high, and the table was like huge. It was like a huge desk. And I was told that they're the homicides that have occurred in the last 2 years. And I looked and I thought, oh my God, there's hundreds here. Not realising that every 2 to 3 days someone is murdered in New South Wales. And the majority of those murders are domestic homicides. So they're ones we would never ever hear about. The homicide's occurred, it's within a home, the offender's caught quite quickly, off you go. And so I was so naive to think that there were hundreds of people being murdered in our state every year. And so picking up some of the files and reading them, I'd seen a lot of them, heard a lot about them in the media, and I thought the first file I ever picked up, like after going through the files there, I thought I'm going to ring up this first one, and if I can get through it, I can get through anything. I picked up one that is the hardest, I thought. And so I did pick up the phone and make a phone call to a mum whose 2 daughters, unborn grandson and husband had been killed in the Terrigal massacre. And that's a phone call I will never, ever forget, like many.
What did you say?
I called, her name's Anne, and I said to her, introduce myself, and I said I was ringing from the mortuary at Glebe, which she was very familiar with, unfortunately, and I asked Anne how she was doing. And she said, what day is it? And I said, it's Wednesday. And she said, oh, I've been in bed since Sunday. And I said, oh, have you? Yep. And I thought, okay. And when was the last time you had something to eat? And she goes, I can't remember. And I said, look, I'm going to hang on the phone if you want to get a cup of tea and a biscuit or something to eat. And she said, oh, okay. And off she went. And I could hear the toilet flushing. I could hear the kettle, the whistle of the kettle. There was movement in the back. 10 minutes, 20 minutes had gone, 30 minutes, and I'm still hanging on. At that point, I thought she's forgotten that I'm on the phone, but I don't know what it was that didn't make me just hang up and try to ring back. And I could hear her, and so I put the phone on loudspeak, and I just doing my work thinking she'll come back, she'll walk past it and she'll see that, you know, the phone's off the hook. And over 35 minutes later, the phone is picked up and she said, hello. And I said, hello. And she said, oh, you're still there. I said, I am. And she said, no one ever hangs up or calls me back. She goes, I'm ready to talk to you now. So then we did talk, and I said, we're thinking of setting up a support group for family members like herself. And she did come to that meeting. And she just became one of the most amazing women, even getting a position on the Serious Offenders Review Council, where she was appointed by Cabinet and the government and the governor to go in and to help in the management of serious violent offenders in New South Wales prisons. That phone call that I made to her changed her life, but what it did for me was change mine, that, well, I'd gone through one phone call, this is good, you know. My biggest lesson was there's no greater homicide than the other. To the family that's happening to, that is the worst that's ever going to happen to them.
You were instrumental in something called Grace's Place. Explain what Grace's Place is and how you got it up and running. With
the many years that I've worked with the Homicide Victim Support Group, there's been a lot of children come through, and children whose parents, like father killed mother or mother killed father or a sibling. There's been a lot of children. And then there's been a lot of children whose parents, they've gone to work and not come home. Someone's killed them in their workplace or on the way to work. So children, I say, are the silent grievers.
So these are kids who've had a mother murdered or a father murdered, sometimes mother murdered by the father.
Yep.
So they're either orphans or they've got a murdered mother and a dad in jail or something like that.
Yeah, or their family members been murdered by a stranger.
And how hard does it sit on their shoulders?
I always liken it to, you know, children go into a protection racket. And what they do, when I say they're the silent grievers, they go into trying to protect the surviving parent or surviving siblings, and they just take things on inside, never ever talking about it. the bullying that they were confronted with, you know. Kids at school, at home, watching TV with their parents. This young person's dad's murder scene is up on the TV. There's a big stigma around homicide. And so with these kids, as they were growing older, I could see that their challenges were becoming greater as well.
You mean like the stigma of murder floats down onto the kids or something?
Totally.
Like some kind of stain?
Oh, my gosh. Huge. Absolutely.
There's shame.
Yeah. Because once upon a time, before the Homicide Victim Support Group was set up, murder was something that happened to bad people. If you're a baddie, you're murdered. And that's been the big part of the education that we do. Murder does not discriminate. It could be, you know, a politician. It could be a nurse. It could be a doctor. It could be the garbage collector. It could be the homeless person on the street. And I thought, oh, my God, like that's another generation of homicide victims we haven't catered for. So it was that phone call that made me think we've got to do something. So in my head I'd been researching a trauma centre for children affected by homicide, but I hadn't got it quite right. So I got an architect, we sat down, I told him what was in my head, what I wanted in this building, a 12-bedroom residential centre where we could bring kids in from country New South Wales, regional areas, kids that got nothing in the country areas. So sand play therapy, music therapy, art and craft therapy, play therapy, counselling rooms specific to the different ages of kids that come in. Got the plans. It was going to be $10 million to build it. Took it to the board and they said, we've got to get this money. And we did get the money. So Stephen Barley was the local mayor out of Blacktown. I asked him for some land and he said, Martha, everybody asks me for land. And I said, but I'm not everybody. This is a world first residential trauma centre that we want to build for children affected by homicide and their families. So he gave us 2 acres of land through the council and Western Sydney Parklands Trust. And then it was a case of the federal government reaching out to them, and at the time Scott Morrison was the federal treasurer. They gave us $6.1 million. The state government gave us $3.3 million, and then we raised $1.6 million for the completion of the building and also for the fit-out. We had a great builder who did a lot of work pro bono. Our architect did all the work pro bono. And then on the 2nd of February 2023, we officially opened Grace's Place, named in honour of Grace Lynch, Anita Cobby's mum.
So bringing kids who are victims of homicides,
Yep.
bringing them all together in the one place, aside from the counselling and the therapy that they have, what does it do for them to be in the presence of only kids who have gone through the same thing that they have? What does it do for them to be in constant contact with other kids like that?
It's a wonderful thing. It's no different to bringing the adults together. They find that they're not the only ones that are going through this. They're not the only ones being confronted with the issues that they go through school. Some of the kids have told us about not being able to concentrate with schoolwork. So now at Grace's Place, we have a tutor that comes in on a regular basis, will tutor the kids. We do programs where we invite the kids to come along. Some of them are fun-based, but many of them are therapeutic-based. And the kids come in together. It's almost like another layer where the adults have their stuff and they do their stuff and they get goodness from that, but the kids have something special for them as well. And so for them, they get back their identities and they can talk to the other kids and talk about their parents or their siblings or about schoolwork, whatever it is that they need to talk, and they're forming such great friendships. And the kids actually say, these are the people that will be my lifelong friends.
Martha, you're a woman of extraordinary energy and persistence. It seems like you are able to do all these incredible things all at once. Did you ever get that lost sleep back that you lost way back when you started work with some infant death syndrome? Are you one of those people that can survive on 4 hours sleep a night?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I never got back to that full night's sleep. I don't need any more than that. And I think when people say to me, my God, Martha, you do so much, I always say, you're a long time dead.
I see you as, we live in a throwaway culture, but it seems to me you're a great mender of broken things. That's what you do. Is that how you see yourself?
Yeah, people are broken, they're hurt, they're damaged. I have a great team around me, like the counsellors that work with Homicide Victims Support Group, our admin team. There's a lot of community support. So when I put out a call that something needs to be done, I love it when people, it's like all hands on deck. And I think with good people around you, you can mend anything. That's my thought.
Given that you'd begun getting involved with Sudden Infant Death Support Network, that all came from you trying to find that cop, that police officer who'd broken down when he attended the scene of the death of your baby boy. Did you ever eventually track him down in the end?
Oh, my gosh, yes. So with Homicide Victims Support Group, I'm doing a training day for the Homicide Detectives course, and I always start with talking about Michael, because that's a big part of how I got to Homicide Victims Support Group, working with the Sudden Infant Death Association, being at the mortuary. And in that class was a young woman who contacted me about a month or so later after the course, and she said, Martha, I found him. And what she had done is gone back to work and put a police all points bulletin out for this police officer that had been to this home in Carlingford and attended their first ever death. This police officer contacted her, and this young man, many years later, described walking up my driveway, the white fence, the steps he walked up, and then what he was confronted with and talked about me. So I had his contact details, and then I met him and his wife. We met at North Rock Shopping Centre in a cafe, and we talked about that day, and he talked about him having children and how my son's death impacted him, being a young dad. I invited him to a fundraising event, our Ebony and Ivory Ball for the Homicide Victims Support Group, for him and his wife to come along, because it was important for me, for him to know that I was okay. And inviting him to a social function was my way of saying to him, thank you for what you did, but I'm okay. And we said goodbye. And that was the last time I saw him and his wife.
Martha, what an amazing conversation to have with someone. It's been incredibly moving and powerful. Thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you.
If you need to call someone after listening to Martha Jabour's story, help and support is always available. Lifeline's there for you 24 hours a day on 13 11 14. On our website, you'll find more information about counselling services for parents and more information about sudden infant death syndrome. Today's conversation was produced on the lands of the Gadigal peoples. Producer was Nicola Harrison. Executive producer is Carmel Rooney. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.